Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of this conference on cyber regulation and harmonization. I'm Vishal Mishra. I am from the School of Engineering, the Computer Science Department. I am the Vice Dean for Computing and AI. And as I was telling Merit earlier, this room in SIPA is probably the room I'm spending the most time in outside the School of Engineering. I keep coming here for different policy-related events. I've personally worked in policy myself quite a bit. I worked on net neutrality and differential pricing. And maybe I'm a day too late, but yesterday I could have spoken about congestion pricing, given the guest was there. But I jest. I'm not the only one who works on policy. The School of Engineering, there are a lot of people who want to do data-driven policy. And the third angle that's here, of cybersecurity, again, Sima is here. Lots of people are working on cybersecurity. And this whole triangle of security, AI, and policy, it's sort of very hot. I was also involved in this bill in California, SB 1047, which the legislation passed, but the governor ultimately vetoed it. And it was all about AI regulation, safety and alignment of AI, and whether AI will kill us one day, or whether bad guys with AI will kill us on one day. Or is the answer the only way to stop bad guys with AI as good guys with AI? And let's keep everything open source. So there's a lot of questions that are in this area of AI and security and cybersecurity. And a lot of work needs to be done, a lot of research needs to be funded. We have people eager to work on it. And hopefully today we'll bring out more conversations on the topic. And so again, welcome to day 2. And I invite Jay Haley to kick off things.
Good morning, and thanks for your patience as we had the slightly delayed start. Great to see everyone here in the room. Thank you for everyone that's joining online. I'm Jason Healy, the director of the SIPA Cyber Program. Thanks again for joining us for day 2. We've got a great set of conversations going today. I'm going to pass it to my deputy, Irva Khan, who's going to introduce the first panel. And after that, we have panels that are going to look at cyber regulation and harmonization for the healthcare sector and for the energy transition. So thank you for being here. For those, allow me to thank our sponsors also, in particular Google Cloud and Microsoft, for their tremendous support. But also the School of Engineering, from whom we just heard, the Data Science Institute, the Institute of Global Politics, JP Morgan Chase, Venable, Kyndryl, and Kroll and Mooring. And so can we thank our sponsors, without whom this would not have happened. And with that, Irva Khan.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Irva Khan, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm currently the coordinator for SIPA's cyber program, and I'm also a proud SIPA alum. What I find so fascinating about cybersecurity is the diversity of perspectives it brings, and yesterday's panels were a perfect example of that. These kind of discussions make me truly happy that I chose to study cybersecurity. We had great conversations on the complexities of cyber regulation, and today promises to build on that momentum. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our distinguished guests, Merit Janow, the Dean Emerita of SIPA, and Kimba Walden, the President of Paladin. We're excited to hear their insights on today's topics.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's great to see so many experts in the room, and I understand we have many people online. This is a fantastic forum created a few years ago by Jay Healy, and every year it's really a privilege to bring to our campus academics, practitioners across multiple disciplines: finance, engineering, public policy, security broadly. And I think this interdisciplinary approach is absolutely essential for thinking about digital cyber challenges in our world today. And this is a great conference and continuation. I couldn't be happier to have this conversation with Kimba this morning. That very brief introduction was fully appropriate to get us into the conversation, but fails to amplify her extraordinary career. So let me just highlight a few things. I mean, a lawyer by training, of course, and currently running an institute affiliated with a security-oriented VC firm. So I think she's exposed to what's happening on the technology front and innovation front. But she comes at this after, a number of years in senior positions in Washington at the Office of National Cyber. She was its inaugural principal deputy starting in 2022 and really centrally involved in the launch of the National Cybersecurity Strategy in 2023 and the implementation plan which followed. And she also executed the joint OMB-ONCD guidance to the federal agencies and has worked on cyber workforce development and education and also been involved in bilateral discussions with some of our major allies on cyber issues. So I guess my first question, as you are a cyber leader in the US government across Republican and Democratic administrations as a cyber professional, before we talk about harmonization of regulation, I think it's really helpful to help us think about how you think US cyber policy has evolved in recent years. And evolved in the environment of a very changing threat landscape. And my sense, and I think we've heard that yesterday, is that this is not a partisan issue. But increasing U.S. government cyber readiness requires investment. And so there are, questions about whether we're spending enough, whether we're spending it in the right ways. Are we working sufficiently with the private sector? Are we really getting our nation prepared and our allies for this changing threat landscape? So I'd love to hear your perspective on how you think our policy has evolved across administrations and in the face of a changing threat landscape.
Sure. Well, first, thank you. Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Merritt. Thank you for inviting me here today to have this conversation and to be a part of yesterday as well. I'm always excited when we can have robust conversation around cyber regulatory harmonization and make it exciting. So let me just, to answer your question, yes, I was a senior cyber lawyer in both the Obama administration and in the first Trump administration, and then a political appointee in the Biden administration. And so I've seen the evolution of our policy in cyber over time, over the course of really since 2008. And the good news is that I have yet to come across anyone that is anti-cybersecurity. Just, there might be some quibble around the edges about how to best leverage our resources, but no one is anti-cybersecurity. And let me give you, I am a policy wonk. I'm a lawyer on a good day. And so I'm going to throw out a whole bunch of numbers that may be meaningless to a lot of people, but hopefully the students will write some of these numbers down. So under the Obama administration, Executive Order 13636 was where President Obama made it clear that it is United States policy to be in partnership with the private sector. He made it clear that critical infrastructure is owned and operated by the private sector and that there is no opportunity for security without that partnership. That was in 2013. Fast forward when President Trump took over in 2016, his first cybersecurity executive order was 13800, which articulated very similar policy, that there must be collaboration between the private sector and the public sector. Fast forward to 14208. 208? 14028. Thank you. 14028, which Ms. Newberger talked about a bit on stage yesterday. And the very same principle was articulated again. And that's to say that throughout the course of changing administrations, there's been a recognition that cybersecurity policy must be executed and designed in collaboration with critical infrastructure owners and operators. And in the US, unlike some other countries, that is primarily owned by the private sector. What's exciting, and that's not even the exciting part, what's exciting is that partnership ethos has evolved over time in the right direction, where there was an acknowledgement of collaboration, but that really meant that you're sharing information, right? So the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act of 2015, CISA 2015, which is up for renewal in 2025, started that process where there were some protections put into place by Congress, bipartisan members. I think the person that sponsored that one was a Republican and a Democratic executive, to make sure that when the private sector shared information with the government in certain ways, they got certain protections. And that was to incentivize information sharing. So in those early days, partnership was really about sharing information. And then that would allow us to take the low-hanging fruit off the table, right? It evolved. So then it became more about, during the Trump administration, more about solving problems together. So for example, right at the beginning of the Trump administration, we had an election security challenge, both the private sector and the public sector. And this time we involved the states because they were constitutionally required to determine the time, place, and manner of elections. And so the states had to be involved in election security, network security. And so that required not just basic indicator information sharing, but bringing the secretaries of state, the election directors, some local officials into the classified space to be able to explain the problem and articulate and explain the problem then on the unclassified side to help figure out what that solution was. So that was a great evolution. It took some work. I make it sound like it was easy. It wasn't. And that went from the Obama administration into the Trump administration, such that we worked together to identify the problem in 2016, worked together to make sure that we did not have similar problems in 2018 and again in 2020. Fast forward, now we get to the era of ransomware at the beginning of the Biden administration. We also had Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And those two things drew me back into government because I saw information sharing, I saw collaboration very differently then. So for example, based on the Russian aggression into Ukraine, the Biden administration took a lot of effort, a lot of chances, a lot of risk in declassifying as much information as it could to put it in the hands of people who could operationalize it. And that was outside of the government. So they put it into the hands of the financial sector in anticipation of there being some sort of retaliation. It's difficult to prove a negative, and I'm hoping that Professor Healy and all of his research assistants can help us figure out how to measure, something not terribly happening. But from my perspective, that is one of the reasons why Ukraine is still standing, that our financial system wasn't harmed in any significant way in retaliation of all the sanctions that were made from a policy perspective. That was an intimate part, that was a collaboration that had evolved from merely sharing indicators of compromise to putting bespoke classified information into the hands of the operators so that they can take action to protect our infrastructure. And then, by the way, Elon Musk in his own way with Starlink, came to the aid of Ukraine. Cisco came to the aid of Ukraine. Government policymakers came to the aid of Ukraine. So there was that's not a cybersecurity issue, but it is, because the satellite systems were attacked at one point in time, early in that aggression. And so all these pieces started to come together in a more intimate way. So that's just from my point of view, and then even further in the last couple of years, there's been even more evolution. But that's the arc, and it doesn't really matter which party is in charge. That's been the arc.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. That's encouraging. And also interesting to hear. So, the Biden administration, I think, has put out more executive orders and sort of, I think, than previous administrations. But the threat landscape has also gotten much more intense, right? And you alluded to ransomware, which is still a huge problem, right? And I'm still waiting to know, who do I call, other than IT department when there's a problem, right? And there really isn't a federal agency that is kind of right on top of it, to my knowledge, to help. There's a self-help through what companies and individuals have to figure out. But the government, I guess, with its own zero trust expectations, new NIST expectations, and so forth, has gotten much less porous, I think. Has it kept up with the threat landscape from what you've seen? Is it obviously our intelligence agencies, by reputation, have outstanding capabilities, but the government as a whole is a very big entity that needed a lot of improvements, and much has been aimed at the government. So do you have any sense of how the government in managing cyber for itself has strengthened, and then is how that is working with the private sector? A little bit more insight on whether that is adding more rigidities to interaction, or they've managed through it so that the innovation environment in the private sector can interact effectively with the government?
Yeah, so let me start answering that question by explaining how I view what the threats are.
Uh-huh.
And from my point of view. And you might have heard some of this yesterday, but to sum it up from my point of view, there are 4 buckets of threat. The nation-state threat that you alluded to, where nation-states are no longer just attacking the United States government. Nation-states are holding our infrastructure at risk, right? That's how they're attacking us, through infrastructure. So there are 2 pieces. There's the cyber criminal gangs. Ransomware is one type. Business email compromise is another type, which is arguably more expensive and less beta. Fraud is part of that. So there's the criminal, the digital crimes. That's another threat. Another is insider threat. You saw that come to fruition with what North Korea has been doing in terms of having people employed inside of companies to hold companies in our critical infrastructure at risk. But then I would argue another type of insider threat, and one that many boards, I think, are beginning to contend with, is apathy, sort of complacency.
Yes.
So I would call that another bucket. The 4th I wouldn't call a threat. I can't call it a threat because it's not. But the 4th is really what we're talking about here, which is the government is all in your systems now. Like they want to know what's happening, they're regulating. The SEC is regulating, I don't know for how much longer, but the Health and Human Services, right? All of the things, all of the parts of government are sort of in your business. That's how I see the 4 buckets. Now, how we deal with those is a matter of, from a policy perspective, is a matter of quibble. I don't think we can any longer think of this as who is the one person I call when there is a ransomware activity in my systems. It is everybody's responsibility. That's what the National Cyber Strategy really was getting at, was we need to focus on resilience, and we need to reassign and take a hard look at allocation of responsibility. From my point of view, the first person that will have some awareness of what's happening is your CISO, but that's the last person you want to bother because they're trying to put the fire out, right? But you also want to be able to call the FBI in your local space and let the government figure out on the back end how to get that information around. Your board is going to want to identify a person that can make very difficult decisions and make them quickly so that the CISO can continue to put the fire out. But everybody, there's an allocation of responsibility. When the Biden executed the National Cybersecurity Strategy, the primary premise there is that we are going to work towards having a defensible and resilient digital ecosystem that's aligned with values. It wasn't, we are going to figure out how to withstand ransomware actors,
yes,
and how we're going to withstand nation-state actors, right? And so that is my perspective of how to.
Thank you. It's a very important perspective, and you know, I've had the privilege of serving on boards of financial services and technology firms, and particularly for financial services, you know, major financial services, this is table stakes for business. And so, you know, the ones that I'm exposed to see the actually investment in cyber as part of their business, actually, so that they innovate. And it is both the services they sell as well, you know, fraud detection and prevention, as well as essential to their operation. So in a sense, I feel like kind of best in class is often in financial services, but you know, this is such a widespread problem, and we know that the threat landscape is only getting more intense, and state actors are, I'm hearing more and more concern about China as a threat actor. You might want to comment a little bit on if you see that. But also it's about, you know, disbursement of capability, you know, in the broader business and civilian population. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that as you think about moving outside of critical infrastructure to, you know, how do we enhance our cyber capabilities and awareness both in the United States and more broadly?
I think the assignment of critical infrastructure sectors is almost handicapping us because our digital infrastructure doesn't operate that way. Financial services is dependent upon transportation, is dependent upon energy. We don't have a critical infrastructure assigned for social media companies or for satellite systems, for that matter. So it's almost a hindrance to think of it in terms of sector by sector. I think we have to evolve. There's still more work to be done where it is more about the maturity and the resilience of enterprise, right, or of small businesses. So all of that's to say is when you start thinking about it in terms of resilience and the business proposition that your resilience is going to enhance your business productivity, then that's where you see a lot of innovation. And I think I think that's how we have to continue to evolve. So in China, for example, if we remain predictable, right? So the U.S. government has been very clear. We have, and this really actually started not too long ago, where we decided we were going to be vociferous about where the threat is, right? So China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. But that's not static. So we worry a lot about China right now. We'll be worrying about some other region of the world or some other country, and I would argue that there are other countries outside of those four that we should be concerned about. So we need to focus more on resilience of processes. We need to focus more on making sure that healthcare services people are able to receive healthcare, right? For example, that's important. So I really see us shifting our thinking, and it's going to take some time, and all of the Columbia SIPA students will figure this out for us, where we have to stop thinking about this as an add-on or as a stopgap, but as something that is actually going to achieve an ROI, not just for enterprises and how they operate, but to be able to deliver services to people, to individuals. I think when we get there, we're less concerned about the specific nation-state actor and more concerned about when someone tries to attack one of the most powerful countries in the world, how quickly are we going to bounce back, right? How quickly are we going to figure it out and close our vulnerabilities? I think that's the more appropriate direction to go. I'd be curious to know what you think about, from a board perspective, how do you think about a nation-state actor like China, or thinking about it in those terms?
Well, I think that obviously boards have got to get much more sophisticated and are, at least the ones that I'm exposed to, cyber and information security broadly is just part of what your responsibilities are for oversight, and it's embedded in the work of audit committees and risk committees. But it's not just defensive. It's also, for some businesses, how do you ensure that you're innovating in this area and you're managing risk appropriately, and so it's deeply integrated into the oversight of the boards that I'm part of, and that means obviously compliance in every necessary way, but it also means interacting with the government through ISACs and other structured, and with board awareness, as well as around the technology itself. So I just think there was a very good panel yesterday talking about setting up these processes in companies and boards, and I just think there's been a tremendous amount of work done in financial services and technology companies around this. So it's good in some places. That doesn't mean it's easy. And it's constant, focus and talent. And that's one of the reasons, one thing I wanted to talk to you about, because I know when you moved over to this, you shared with me to head this institute, one of the reasons you shared with me was because you wanted to think about the people development side, as well as not just expanding capabilities in this country, but also around the world. And the needs are global, and the talent development needs to be accelerated here, but everywhere. And so I wondered if you have some thoughts you could share with us about what that looks like. And I'll just throw out one. I've seen I've been part of efforts, for example, by MasterCard to work with a Singapore university to create a technical institute on workforce training. And that is a form of public-private collaboration for workforce development. And That seems to me a powerful model that you could take many places in the world. And there have also been ideas, I remember during the Obama administration, a cyber Blue Ribbon Commission that recommended that we set up a system where you could send people into the government and they would know that they had a job on the other side. Or from government into the private sector. And of course, you have to set up protections so that there isn't a bias or, there are hazards in this. But in terms of skill development, it's a real need. We have to increase the numbers. It's a global need. How do you think we advance this in a productive way?
Oh, there's so many good questions there. And thank you for reminding me about that program. That's a woefully underutilized program. There was, I can't remember what we called it, but there was that program, and then there was the loaned executive program. But I have to think about that one. So in terms of the people part of cyber, we all know that cyber is technology, people, process. The people part of cyber is specifically unique in that we developed this particular domain, right? We're in it, unlike air, land, sea, water, space. But our security is only as good as Singapore's security or Costa Rica's security or name the other country is only as good as anyone else's security. And for a long time, the U.S. policy, and I'm overgeneralizing, I realize that in 5 minutes, but the U.S. policy has been, let's not have Huawei ZTE in your tech stack, right? Thou shalt not. Instead of offering some sort of alternative. And the alternative, if you listen to what people need in our partners across borders, they need to deliver the same types of services that we're delivering to their citizens, to the people there. And so, okay, what are you offering then? So when Huawei comes in, they come in with a full stack, that's interoperable, and they offer managed services and their training. What are you doing? How are you helping us? And so when I got to Paladin Capital Group, the challenge was put to me. If you believe all the words in the National Cybersecurity Strategy, and you believe that we have to shift cyber risk responsibility to those that are better resourced to buy it down, that's us. We invest in emerging technologies. We invest globally. We have offices all over the world. How do we do? Tell us what we need to do. Oh, let's develop technologies that are interoperable and can be used as a competitor to the most popular and the least expensive technologies that are available to these countries. Let's figure out how to offer capacity building and partner the way that you did in Singapore, and I know that MasterCard's in other countries doing similar work.
Yep.
How do we develop a workforce that is, we just launched a paper yesterday that talks about civics and STEM and technology. How do we have a workforce that has the engineering aptitude to rebuild our digital infrastructure? Because in some cases, we need to rebuild the backbone of our internet, but do so in a civically responsible way. How do we build that capacity particularly in underinvested communities, not only here at home, but across the globe? Because let's face it, our digital economy is entirely dependent upon everybody else's. And so if we just focus on us and not focus on the global us, we're losing more slowly.
Well, thank you for that. I'm always proud when we have forums where we have policy leaders and engineering leaders in the same room. I feel like we're doing the right thing somehow. We have only a few minutes. I know we have maybe collect a question or two, if that's all right with you. Right here in the front.
So
think there's a mic coming so that people online can hear you.
Well, thank you for the wonderful conversation. Now, one word which kept coming up during the conversation was ransomware. And ransomware has been enabled by Bitcoin. You don't go to an alley with a briefcase full of $5 million and pay off someone, or do a wire transfer using a Swift code. You use Bitcoin. Bitcoin and cryptocurrency in general, I think, is a national security threat. So what has been sort of the policy position at the government level to control this?
Okay, so fortunately it says please wrap up. So it depends on who you talk to in the government. Here's where there's common ground. Ransomware is something that we have to address and have to eradicate. There are choices that we can make, though, to do that. Ransomware is successful because the costs for entry of that crime are low, and the payout is high. And so there are a whole lot of policy choices that we can make in order to raise the cost of crime and to attack the profitability of that crime. I will argue, or I will tell you, objectively, ransomware existed before crypto. Well, not at this rate, I get it, but the crime existed, right? They were just using payment cards, or they were using suitcases of cash, which are very difficult to track from a law enforcement perspective. But the crime is just too easy to commit. So here are the policy choices. We're not going to get rid of crypto. We're not going to get rid of blockchain. Blockchain is just really, you're an engineer, you can explain blockchain better than I can, but it's just merely a method of cryptology, right? We're not going to get rid of crypto. We can regulate it. We can make crypto exchanges money services businesses, which would provoke a lot of things. We can cause other jurisdictions to deploy know your customer laws or anti-money laundering laws. We can get to making the crypto market look more like the fiat market. And we can do a better job at going after the profitability by the weak spot in that crypto to fiat exchange, right? We can go and grab that money and claw it back. We need banks, traditional banks, to work with crypto exchanges and mixers. That is difficult to do, but you can get the bad guys that way. But more importantly, we need to throw salt in the gears to make it more difficult to commit the crime of ransomware. Unfortunately, that will mean that those criminal syndicates will find a different way to make money, but we really do need to focus there as well. How about we help companies figure out which data is their high value data and put requirements on it, or develop encryption that will allow that data to stay safe. I don't know what those buckets are. I'm hoping engineers figure that out. But we need to figure out how to make it less attractive to become. Maybe we ban. This is I'm making news here because I've said it differently before. Maybe we ban ransom payments when your system is not locked up, because we're seeing an evolution where ransomware actors are no longer locking up systems, they're just stealing the data because people know that they'll pay for the data. I know that the data still remains available for re-extortion, so how about we ban payments for getting your data back? That makes it more difficult, right? There are so many different policy choices that we can take that aren't just about trying to outlaw crypto, because I think that is not something that objectively can happen.
Well, that was a provocative ending. Bravo. I mean, it's it really is a question of what burdens do you put on whom in dealing with a really pernicious problem. But there are many in this world. So this has been a fantastic start to a conversation. I wish we had more time. Please come back, and please join me in thanking Kemba Walden for being with us today.
Hello everyone, my name is Samuel Dab. I'm a student here at SIPA. I'm also a research assistant with Professor Healy, with whom I've been working on cybersecurity regulation harmonization, and more specifically why we currently are in a state of regulatory disharmony. And it's my great pleasure today to introduce our panel on cybersecurity in healthcare, and I will hand it over to our great SIPA adjunct professor, Beth Cartier, who is going to introduce the panel.
Hi, everybody. I am Beth Cartier. I'm an adjunct professor here at SIPA. First, I want to say thank you so much to SIPA and Columbia for putting this on. And I'd love to have our panelists introduce themselves, and thank you so much for joining us today. Ari, do you want to start?
Sure. I'm Ari Schwartz with Venable and the Center for Cybersecurity Policy and Law.
Hi. Hello. Drew Hanchett. Hi, how are you? I'm the Chief Health Information Officer at the Department of Health in New York State.
Hi, I'm Bo Woods. I wear a lot of different hats in healthcare, but most notably, I'm with an all-volunteer pro bono initiative called I Am the Cavalry, and I help run an event called the CyberMed Summit in DC and often in California.
Thanks. I'm actually really excited about this panel. I know people aren't like, yeah, cybersecurity regulations in healthcare, this is wild. But I really do think that we have a really great sort of breadth of opinion here. So why don't we sort of start with just sort of looking at the current state of regulations and frameworks, right? We look at two huge breaches this year, Change Healthcare and Kaiser. You know, they're at least sort of compliant with some of the common frameworks. So what does that tell us about sort of the current state of regulations, the need for regulations, and sort of the current environment? Ari, you want to start?
Sure, although I think maybe Drew should start. He's actually coming up with the regulations. I don't know. But,
Yeah, so it's interesting. I fancy myself a cybersecurity practitioner, not a cybersecurity expert. So I'm very excited to be sitting here with experts. But you know, what it says is current state isn't working, right? When we address these attacks that are going on now. So in New York, we took the step to promulgate some regulations. It was a long process. I think we did it. Hearing conversations yesterday at the federal level, they were talking about rolling out regulations and then hearing feedback on them later. We took the preemptive steps of having those conversations with our healthcare providers and our healthcare associations early. We've had a couple rounds of regulations, a couple rounds of public comment that we addressed in feedback. So it really was a collaborative effort to get those big baseline regulations out the door. Are they perfect? Probably not. I don't think there is a perfect regulation that comes out. But New York State felt like there was a need to do something and push the envelope there. So we're excited. The regulations are out. Our healthcare providers in New York, our hospitals have a year to comply with those. And we'll be working in lockstep to make sure that that kind of rising tide raises all boats type of thing.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I think that you're seeing that kind of response from regulators broadly, where you have that in several other states as well, where there's some interest at least in regulating, and then you also see the HIPAA security rule, new HIPAA security rule draft is expected out before the end of the year, and you have two different bills in Congress, neither of which are that likely to pass, but still, a lot more momentum toward regulation in this space than you've seen in many years in healthcare because of the incidents, and also just because there's been a general feeling of failure in different parts of the sector.
Sure, but even your initial answer is that you're sort of getting immediately to some issues you might have, like complexity, right? We're talking about hospitals, federal, nonprofit. So what are some of the challenges? You know, I know we're not going to get perfect, but sort of what are the challenges specific to healthcare and regulation that we're looking at?
Yeah, I think healthcare is really interesting. It's different for a lot of reasons. One, it's the nature of modern healthcare is hyper-connected. So in doing some of our tabletop exercises, clinical simulations, talking with a lot of hospitals through the CyberMed Summit, we learned that if hospitals don't have fresh water for like 2 or 3 hours, then they pretty much shut down. You're back to, pre pre-modern industrial healthcare, and it's really, really hard to do anything because the doctors have to wash up and all of that. So interconnectivity of like healthcare with water, healthcare with power, obviously, with cold chain and logistics and transportation. So if you don't get medications there in a certain time, under a certain temperature, then they go bad. That's one of the complexities of healthcare and one of the things that makes it unique. Secondly, I would say that within healthcare, there are many different sub-industries like medical device manufacturers who have very different sets of incentives, very different capabilities and roles to play than healthcare providers, which are different from electronic health records manufacturers, which are different from payments and billing, which is different from insurance, which is different from, you've got all of these others that make it difficult. And then third, and these are not the only differences that make healthcare different, but the consequences in healthcare are different than the consequences in financial services, for instance. So I know that, Ari, you mentioned HIPAA, and a lot of people, when they hear healthcare cybersecurity, they think, oh, well, patient data, that's the thing. But I want you to stop thinking about patient data and just, at least for the session of this panel discussion, whenever you hear security, think patient safety, think patient lives. When I was at CISA, I spent a couple of years at CISA along with Jay and some other folks, and we did a definitive analysis on a healthcare ransomware that showed when a hospital gets hit with ransomware, there's an uptick in elective mortality rates. In other words, people die from ransomware. It's not about patient data, patient health. Care that's denied, degraded, or unable to be delivered. Those are the things that I care most about in healthcare. But it makes it tricky to do when you have a lot of requirements that are focused around data, for instance. So, the idea that we generally have in cybersecurity of like, if you get your password wrong 3 times, lock people out. Well, when I was working at a hospital, you walk in on a Saturday night and you see that the doctors are going around, they always forget their passwords. So if you lock them out after 3 times, then they've got to call the help desk to get it reset. That's a 15-minute process. How many people are going to die in that 15 minutes? Well, on a Saturday night, a busy Saturday night, it might be non-zero, and that's probably not okay. That's a policy failure to have people die because of your security controls and protections. It's also a policy failure to have people die because you don't have security protections in place. So it's a very different type of scenario and environment than a lot of other industries.
Go ahead, Drew.
No, just a quick follow-up on that, because the intent of the regulations in New York are pointed just towards that, right? To that continuity of healthcare for patients. We have a very mature health emergency preparedness program in New York to respond to other threats, as you mentioned, storms, water, and it all comes down to are our entities ready and able to deliver that healthcare. And cybersecurity is just another aspect, another threat of that, where we didn't have those in the book of regulations that we have for our entities. And how do we start to, as a state, identify that, reduce the scope of that threat, and be helpful in terms of response?
I think it's really interesting because I think from the business aspect of things, you always hear about sort of, the lockout issue, but to really tie that into sort of the patient impact, it's not just a business continuity thing, it's really a patient health thing. But you did touch on ransomware, which I know is huge in hospitals right now. It's a very, topic of a lot of concern. Where is the responsibility, if any, for the government to sort of help hospitals prepare and respond to that? Is that a shared responsibility? Sort of where does that sort of shared model lie?
Yeah, I mean, there is some concern, some piece of this that is government-oriented. One thing that has been raised, and I think there's been some focus from the federal government, and some states have gotten involved now too, is the focus, going back to some of the things Bo was talking about, the things you need for hospitals to be able to run. Rural hospitals have a particular problem, right? Because Here, a hospital might be able to get shut down from ransomware, but you can go to the other side of the park and go to another hospital. Yeah, people might die on the way there. In some cases, it's not the greatest situation, but it's not that far to go. But in a rural space, the closest hospital might be 100 miles away. And so there you end up with a situation where people are going to die, absolutely, if the hospital gets shut down. So that is a lot of the focus right now, and I know some other countries have looked at what the U.S. is doing there as a model as well, which might actually help in some ways with the international harmonization of it as well. I don't know. Drew, you were talking a little bit before about the role things you're looking at in rural spaces too. So.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So as we went through our public comment period, so first of all, I'll say across the board, there was nobody that was opposed to them in general. Everybody was like, regulations, paying attention to this is a good idea. They had major concerns on particular areas, and one of those that came up is how do we support those more rural or segregated hospitals, right? So in New York, as you well know, we have very mature hospital systems and larger hospitals. And it was interesting in our conversations with them, so we had some of our larger mature ones raising that concern. Well, what about, the small ones, neighborly? So, that brings us into discussions around how do we support those smaller, more rural entities. And people were raising their hands to help think through that and support from a shared service model, or one of the parts of our regulation is that hospitals are required to have a CISO on board. What does that look like? Do they have the resources to actually do that? So we start to look at things like potential shared CISO model. So 3 rural hospitals have a contracted CISO that really can support 3 different entities, as an example. So it definitely come up as a concern, and I think in New York we have hospital associations and large hospital systems that are willing to work with us at the state on these regulations to really figure out ways to support them as well.
I think healthcare is really interesting in the shared model of responsibility, because there's regulations not only on the healthcare providers themselves, largely at the state level, a little bit at the federal level through Center for Medicare and Medicaid Studies, but there's also regulation on medical device manufacturers. So some of the equipment going into hospitals. And I think that the National Cybersecurity Strategy calls out very clearly that they want to see more of that across other industries, more of that type of shared accountability of pushing accountability responsibility upstream to some of the providers who are in the best position to fix some of these issues at their root. And as an example, when I was at SIPA, spent a couple of years there, like I mentioned, we saw that at one point a bunch of hospitals got hit with ransomware all at the same time. And we traced down the root cause, and it was their EHR vendor who had opened up a remote administration terminal on their networks, didn't tell the hospitals about, and the hospitals couldn't change from that provider to someone else in the middle of COVID. So they really had no choice. And yet electronic health records providers are excluded from regulation from some of the FDA's medical device regulations, even though they might fit that. There's been a deliberate choice to not have them as a regulated entity. So I think that one of the things that could be in the shared model is that the government can ensure that regulations are applied in a smart way. So it's not just putting 100% of the responsibility on the healthcare providers themselves. It's ensuring that it goes upstream to some of the other providers in that space. And in particular, I think the Change Healthcare for all of us showed us how dependent healthcare is and patient health is on insurers and insurance and keeping the payments flowing. So while there was some requirements and regulations around payers before, I think that strengthening those to the resilience of care delivery, Drew, like you said, from kind of an all hazards approach could be a way that we could balance the load across the healthcare ecosystem.
So I think there's a lot there to dig into, but I think the obvious question, since it's sort of this regulation panel, is when we start talking about medical device manufacturing and sharing the burden and pushing things sort of upstream, how does that impact innovation, right? We start talking about, wearables and AI and, where is the sort of the sweet spot between regulations that are practical and effective and not stifling some of the more impactful stuff on, patient safety and health that might be coming down the line?
I think that regulation, particularly in this area, can be fantastic for innovation. I don't see that those two things are at odds, even though often you say, regulation, innovation, stifles. It's like it just stops the conversation, but I think it shouldn't, because regulation and changing directions can focus these organizations on what you want them to focus on. So in last October, some of the FDA's new guidance on medical device manufacturers went into effect, requiring them to submit security plans, security programs, evidence of security capabilities alongside their submission to go onto the market. And many of the most innovative medical device makers who have popped up in the last decade or so, they're entirely used to building some of these security capabilities into their development process. When I was at the FDA, we worked with a handful of organizations, a handful of medical device makers on new pathways to market for software as a medical device. And it was funny to see that some of the things that, half the room was old legacy traditional medical device makers. They said, you can't do any of those security things. That would stifle innovation. It's just not possible to do that in software. The other half was these young startups. They said, wait, you can't build software without doing those things. Like, what are you doing? This is archaic, right? So I don't think that those two things are at odds at all. And in fact, I think that if we want to see better outcomes, we want innovation toward those outcomes rather than just indiscriminate and everywhere.
Yeah, it's the innovation versus stifling it and regulations and control. I approach it from a parent perspective, right? So kids want to go outside and explore and play, right? There's 3 different paths. We lock the door and say, you're not going. Then we're all miserable, mom and dad included, right? Or we say, go on out and go play, no holds barred. Then mom and dad are still a little nervous, and or miserable. Or we set them loose with some guidelines, and that could look like we're going with them, right? And then we go out and we explore it together, and we're teaching and we're learning together and setting some guardrails around what it looks like to explore, right? So it's really those 3 approaches when it comes to this as well, and which one are we going to take? And from state government perspective, we're kind of one of the parents in the room right now. So those are the decisions that we need to make.
I mean, I agree with what's been said, although I would put it in the context of some of the things that were said yesterday about the balance between risk-oriented regulation versus controls-oriented regulations. That's not saying that you can't have some types of control, but if you say, well, we need to have multi-factor authentication on every piece of technology, and then you require a certain type of multi-factor authentication, that's not going to work in the hospital context that Bo was talking about before, where people have to have access immediately to some things. It has to be a certain type of multi-factor that works for that kind of device, and certainly those that are more like app data centric versus something that's more akin to operational technology, you're going to have different types of multi-factor or different types of even authentication that's necessary for that to be able to work. And if you try and just come up with the one that you think that for the especially in a sector as diverse as this, try and come up with the case study that you saw that failed at one point and try and put that on the whole industry without thinking through all of the permutations and all the secondary consequences, it's going to end up in a situation where it will stifle innovation and actually people just won't follow it. So I think that it has to have that kind of more risk-oriented structure to it, with a little bit more detail on top of that to make it work.
I think it's really one of the more complex parts of this, right? You have, again, my healthcare background is more like software application related, very, very different than a legacy hospital environment, right? And balancing those two, I think it's a frustration that we've had because like our needs are so different, both from a actual need of security and also the inability to comply with some of the current sort of frameworks out there. That does, however, I can't wait. I think you have teenagers, so I really would love to see how this parenting model works.
That's as far as I'll take it. Sorry.
They're not here. But as far as, we've also touched a lot on sort of cross-sector coordination, right? Understanding that, there's like nonprofits involved, there's obviously industry involved, insurers. Where are some sort of areas where cross-sector coordination is currently working, and where are some areas of opportunity?
Well, I mean, I'll point to one that we work with very closely, which is of the ISACs that are out there, the information sharing and analysis centers for different sectors, the Health ISAC one, especially over the last 10, 15 years, has become really one of the big success stories where most of the industry is really working together now through the ISAC, getting threat information out there, looking at the analysis, working with some other sectors, doing exercises on a regular basis together, learning from each other. If you're in the healthcare sector and you're not working with Health ISAC, highly recommend getting involved there. And I think that has been a success. It crosses all these kind of boundaries that we're talking about here. And it's been able to kind of address some of the questions about like what happens in different subsectors here and how do we get them to engage together.
Yeah, so from my perspective, I would just echo Ari. We've been engaged with Health ISAC. We find it a great resource from a state perspective in terms of that threat intelligence. And over the past couple of days, yesterday in particular, they were talking about harmonization across sectors. And I think the healthcare sector is so complex that I'd love to focus on harmonization within the healthcare sector first, and then maybe we have some good lessons learned there when we start to look across sectors. And the Health ISAC is one model I think that is effective in the healthcare sector.
I mean, on that point, I'll just pick up on your point about the complexity and how regulations work together and being able to read that across sectors and do harmonization. I mean, this is exactly what the NIST cybersecurity framework was built for, as people know. I mean, I worked on it from the beginning, so I'm a very big advocate for it, and it's been very successful, and most of the sectors have picked up. But the health sector is the perfect example for that because you're talking about the complexity there, and then you have the ability to boil it down to the same sets of controls and even up to the function level, say function control, sub-control level here, and that allows it to work across sectors, right? So the things from other sectors you can bring into the healthcare sector, but even across the subsectors within healthcare, we know that what the control is, that allows it to be a lot more risk-oriented, and you to write the regs and write the rules internally and write profiles around that within an organization that can work across the different subsectors here based on that control set.
So I'll disagree a little bit with that. I think it was 2022, CISA put out their cyber performance goals. It was, I think, 35 or 40 different specific things, many of them light touch, like put a security.txt file on your website that has your security contact info so people can contact you if you have an issue. And the White House said, we want these to be the baseline for all industries. We think they're common across all sectors. So take these and build on them, extend them for what works in your sector. The healthcare sector, hospitals, healthcare delivery organizations came back and said, yeah, we're going to cut that number down by half. And then of that half, we're only going to say that 10 are really important and the other 10 are optional. And Nate Kuchar, who's the CISO of Vermont, University of Vermont Healthcare, when they got hit with ransomware and they were down for several months, he said that they had almost all of those. They had all of the 10 required, 8 of the 10 optional ones, and they were still down for several months because it wasn't about IT operational capabilities. It was about restoring healthcare delivery and that continuity of healthcare delivery, like Drew talked about. When the healthcare-specific cyber performance goals were released, they said, all right, this is what's going to get us out of critical condition by 2029. And that was, I think, a week or two after Change Healthcare happened. So I don't think it's acceptable to most people to have more and more Change Healthcare style massive disruptions for another 5 years. I think we need to do something more, and we need to do something faster than what those can accomplish. And maybe it's not, the 40 of the CISA cyber performance goals. Maybe it's a subset of that. Maybe it's a handful that can stop the majority of these types of issues. Or maybe it's looking at things like, doing more, you do emergency disaster preparedness around tornadoes, earthquakes, hurricanes. What about around cybersecurity? Can those be part of what gets instantiated into some of the hospital resilience and healthcare delivery resilience that we all want to see?
I mean, your summary there is exactly the problem I've had with the cyber performance goals, right? What you spelled out, which is it is trying to boil it down to something less than the NIST cybersecurity framework, right? And so the NIST cybersecurity framework is looking at this, and then you can have profiles that do, for the healthcare sector or for a subset of the healthcare sector, and then you can have a profile that's ransomware oriented to cross-cut that, and you can focus on those main controls in order to get to say, okay, this is how we go about protecting it. But if you say, we're not going to do all the cybersecurity framework because that's too large for small organization to understand, or we want to focus on measurement. They've used lots of different reasons that they want to boil down the number of things from the cybersecurity framework. You come with some subset, and then you try and use that across a whole industry like healthcare, and you're not getting at the right stuff to stop ransomware in the healthcare sector. So it's not, you're not looking at it from as broad of a risk perspective as you would if you were just using the NIST cybersecurity framework the way that it's supposed to be used. That said, I understand why a small organization might want to have something like the CPGs, especially a board of a small organization, might want to have something like CPGs so you have a checklist of stuff to do, right? That's helpful, but it's not going to solve the problem for that organization of, okay, we have a new threat that's out there. Are we actually addressing that threat? I think that the key is really, are we taking a risk-based approach here? How are we figuring out what our biggest threat is, and how are we addressing it? Regulations can help push people in that direction, but that's not a security program.
I can see you with your mic.
Sorry. No, this is a fascinating conversation for me. Again, in terms of our regulations, it is written from a risk-based approach perspective, and my CISO currently is going through an exercise of mapping our regulations line by line to the kind of federal level guidelines and guidance that these guys are talking about, right? The NIST framework 853 and the performance goals. And it's a really interesting exercise in making sure that our regulations align with what's coming out from the field in terms of guidance and best practice. So that'll be an interesting product when it's complete.
There's harmonization in action, which is the...
Because I think my next question would be like, given this, do we need another set of regulations, right? I mean, consultants have made billions of dollars mapping them all together, right? So what is the issue? I'm not part of the conversations like why can't we just say, hey, NIST, CSF, go for it? Like, what is the major pushback? Resources because of the size of businesses, or sort of what's the concern there?
Well, I mean, as a consultant that maps these things, I can't really complain. However, I would say, I mean, the issue, again, there's sort of a feeling after each bad thing that happens, we must react immediately and have something to do. And that creates more stuff out there, right? So, and the NIST cybersecurity framework was supposed to solve that problem. But it's a big, I mean, cybersecurity is a big area. So if you're not, if you don't have unlimited resources to make sure that you're doing the best of every control set, then you have to do a risk analysis of that. And a lot of organizations are still not started at all, right? So then it comes down to, the regs have to focus on the thing that's important for right now. And so then we end up back in the same conversation again about how do we get them to do this stuff that we know is bad right now? So that the Bo's point, we don't end up like 5 years from now, get to the point where they're putting the stuff in place that can protect from the thing that we know is bad today? How do we get it to be job number one today? And so just having a risk-based framework out there helps the people that have the knowledge and want to do the right thing, but it doesn't help for the organizations that have no starting point and don't know where to go, and really maybe don't have any incentive to do the right thing. So how do we get those people as well? So it's both trying to cover all at the same time, especially in a sector as broad as this. It's a policy challenge. So.
Yeah, and I think if you look back in I think it was 2017, the HHS Cybersecurity Healthcare Task Force report was released, and on the front page of it, it's got like, here's 5 things that cause issues in the healthcare sector. 5 of the root causes for cybersecurity issues, and I think it was the number one thing was that the vast majority of healthcare providers lack a single full-time qualified security person on staff. So when we talk about who's going to do the risk assessment, who's going to implement these things, like a lot of these organizations they're resource starved. They're what the White House and SIPA has called target-rich cyber poor. They just don't have the capability to do a lot of these things, and so we've got to find someone in the ecosystem who can help. I love the idea of shared services, shared CISOs. That's one of the things that came out of that 2017 report was an update to the law that allowed it to be possible for unrelated healthcare organizations to work together on things like cybersecurity, which was fantastic. We also need to, like I said, move upstream, move to some of the larger providers, not healthcare providers, but larger technology providers, so that when an HDO healthcare delivery organization gets their technology put in place, they don't have to go around and spend a bunch of money on top of what they've already spent for the technology to secure it. It's more securable out of the box. It sets things up to where you can do, security, where you can do forensic analysis if you need to, where you can be more agile in incident response, et cetera. So I think that there are a handful of things that we can look at that have some policy levers to pull, and that get us away from, whose regulation or whose cyber framework is best and which 20, 40, 80 points are the ones that you should put in place.
Awesome, thank you. So with that, thank you so much for that discussion. And we have a bit of time for Q&A. If anyone in the audience? Professor Healy.
That's really amazing, thanks. And I'm still working through in my own head, like where the regulations are to help the small thing, like a particular hospital in which are looking for the sector as a whole on the crash. So this gave me a lot. I'll try and just 2 quick ones. One, I liked what you brought up, Bo, there at the end of, hey, we passed this law that made these things possible, right? So are there changes that we need in the law that can remove the headwinds to help that are preventing good things from happening? And I'm really not concerned, but yesterday Governor Hochul said, hey, New York State is ahead on this, and we're going to be doing what we need to do. Are we seeing more states that are following what New York State is doing on hospitals, and what can we do to try and keep all of that going in the right direction? Thank you.
So yeah, I don't have a sense of the landscape for other states, but I will say my door's open, my phone line's open. I would love to collaborate with any other states that are thinking about this to share experiences and the like.
Yeah, I also don't know that other states are doing the same thing, but they should. I think that I'll be really interested to see how your program comes out once you start getting feedback from the organizations that have implemented these things. Like, how does it work for them? Does it work for them? What roadblocks are they running into? So that other states can learn from what's worked and what hasn't. And so that everybody can build on that.
Yeah, this next year will be really interesting. So the regs were promulgated in the first week in October, I believe, and they have a year to comply with them. So I think we'll learn a lot over the next year as our varying levels of organizations wrestle with these regulations.
We might actually organize something with the other states.
Thanks. I love how you sort of set that up. They're like, hey, by the way, I think we're doing this too, which is great. Any other questions from the audience?
Hi, thanks for a nice, robust conversation. People love to point to HIPAA as a data privacy practice that intersects security and privacy. What would you advise people who are looking at that in terms of not a regulation so much, but a security and privacy practice, and say this is something where you should put these two together? I know we didn't talk about HIPAA here, but it's something that comes up a lot in terms of how people are designing what, not so much information security practices, but data privacy practices. Thanks.
I'd say, I mean,
Sorry, further context.
yeah.
AI.
AI. Well, I'd say that the, it was a pretty light touch security piece in particular originally, and the privacy parts, especially notice consent, were much heavier handed in the original reg. So, and now we're expecting the new move, we'll see what the new draft looks like, to be a little more specific in terms of what the security side will bring to it. And I think part of that is around concern, some of the concerns you see from new technologies, including AI, that they're moving in that direction. But it's also that the sort of change healthcare situation as well, like that there was this view, well, isn't healthcare regulated? And well, not really in that way. So was sort of the attitude about it, especially because it was a data issue in that case, and this is data that it's supposed to be covering. So so I would say, because there have been a lot of compliance efforts and cases of where they've been brought against for security failures under HIPAA, but that's because people were doing absolutely nothing, right? Not because they were doing the thing. When I was in government, so this is still 10 years ago, people from the FTC used to say to me, it used to be, 10 years before that, so 20 years ago, we'd have these cases where people would be doing absolutely nothing, and now, 10 years ago, they're just investing in the wrong stuff or not investing enough. And those were the cases they were bringing 10 years ago for security. And I think healthcare is behind that, right? So the cases that we've seen in HIPAA are still the cases where people were doing absolutely nothing that were being brought, and now they're trying to raise it up to the cases where they've been investing in the wrong stuff. So healthcare, even though it's been regulated for a long time in the healthcare data area, it's behind in terms of just the general viewpoint of how much to be investing and what to be investing in, and are you really a focus on, are you investing in the right stuff, which is where some of this work comes in. But this is going beyond just the data piece of it, but the data piece in particular, there hadn't been as much focused on that. So as far as that ties to new technologies, we'll have to see if that actually works or not with the new regs, right? And whether the new administration will actually put the new regs into place. I don't think there's that much resistance to it, but we have to see what they are. So.
Any other questions from the audience? So I'm actually going to click on that a little bit as far as the data privacy. This is a little bit off topic, but as far as the sort of increase in third-party data aggregators, especially for health data, I know that this is sort of more of a security panel than necessarily a privacy panel, but Ari's already smiling, so go for it.
No. You mean in terms of the security of third-party data aggregators for healthcare?
Just like sort of the lack of controls around how the lack of privacy controls around how this data is being used and aggregated and handed around.
I mean, it's somewhat of a complicated issue because. And it's been talked about for a really long time. There's a lot written about it because, also tied up in that is health, health trials and just some of the academic work around healthcare and health. We learn a lot about healthcare through aggregating data on healthcare. So a lot of times the kind of same data that we use that we have complaints around for the sales, et cetera, and so there've been attempts to try and put controls on the use of the data versus the aggregation of the data, and that probably makes a little more sense because you do want to get the benefits out of what we learn from blind studies, et cetera. Part of the reason there's been a move to be able to kind of figure out how to anonymize data better, and use advanced math to anonymize more data, is directly for healthcare for this purpose, right? Can we still aggregate it together and solve some of these issues? It hasn't solved every issue in the space, and people still want to do healthcare studies and trials that you can map and figure out. At the same time, you don't want to aggregate that information. So, but it becomes very complicated. So it's not. I think a lot of times we hear of something bad that happens, and then people, there's a heavy reaction to it. But then in this particular space, there's a lot of benefit from keeping all the data and it's around, right? So, which makes it a lot more complicated. We've learned a lot and we've made some progress, but I think there's still more to do to stop. And, you were talking before about the overregulation and the innovation. I think that balance is a lot harder in the privacy space for healthcare than it is in some other spaces. But
I would tend to agree, just like the stakes are so high, but the opportunity is so great.
Yeah.
So, Jay?
Okay.
And actually, yeah, Jay, and then in the back.
Oh, okay. I'll make it quick then. Sorry for what may be a basic question. Where I'm used to more regulation for the finance sector or the technology sector, where the U.S. isn't the only player because they're multinational companies. Curious, in what aspects of healthcare do we have to, are we focused on what Europe especially might be doing, or maybe to some degree Japan or other countries?
I know at least in medical devices, these are global markets for those devices. So in many cases, other countries just draft off of, well, if it's cleared by the FDA, it's good enough for us too. Not all countries do that. Some of them have their own standards. And in Europe, for instance, like CE mark has a specific medical device testing, security testing, and if you can clear that, you can be on the market in Europe. But I think that there is an opportunity there to raise the tide line for medical devices globally by having whoever pops their head up and has the best, strictest, most robust cybersecurity requirements for medical devices. Everybody else in the world is going to benefit from that. And even if it's not regulation, like the Mayo Clinic used to do this, they would push back on their medical device makers and force them into a higher set of capabilities because they recognized that they could do it for themselves and everyone else would benefit. So they were much more forceful than they necessarily needed to be just for the Mayo Clinic.
So I'd say I totally agree with that. Devices is the main one, but health apps as well, which sort of falls in the same thing, gets in that category. And the main reason for it actually is because in most of the rest of the world, health data is run by the government, right? The government systems, our health systems are government systems. I see our UK people here as examples sitting a few rows behind you, right? It's about government use of data and not about private sector use of data. So different situation. Yeah.
In the back.
What I find fascinating about the medical and the health sector is it's one of the most purely civilian infrastructures that we can think of. So I'm curious, as we think about the international landscape and the discussion about norms, criminal actors targeting different sectors, whether you sense any push from the healthcare sector or hospitals that say, but we should be protected. We have the Red Cross or the Red Crescents on us. We've always been better protected than a lot of others. Is there any, apart from the regulatory side of things, is there kind of a sense by the sector that more should happen at that level? Because a hospital is different from a bank. No offense to the financial sector representatives in the room, but whether there's any sense of that has transpired. We heard Anne talk about the UN Security Council session last week where the head of the WHO spoke, and I was just curious what you're picking up on that.
Yeah, I know that there have been some efforts, for instance, with the International Red Cross, where they were going to try and come up with a system to label hospitals as hospitals on the internet somehow. So the theory being that if attacking a hospital in wartime is a war crime, then how do you ensure that people who might attack them understand that it's a hospital and that you might suffer more consequences than if you're going after a bank, for instance. I also know that there have been a few private sessions where I've heard people say, like, if you go after hospitals as a cyber criminal or as a nation state, we're going to especially go after you with offensive capabilities or to the extent that you can with sanctions and other things. So I've heard a lot of conversation around that. I don't know that that's necessarily manifested in more restraint by adversaries. It used to be that a lot of them would, if they hit a hospital, they'd back off. They'd say, sorry, we didn't know this was a hospital, we'll unlock you. Ransomware actors. During COVID, I think that shifted, and now it's just all fair game to most of them.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. We're at time. I want to say thank you again to SIPA and Columbia for having us, and thank you to the panelists for being here. Excellent conversation. Thank you. And I think, Ari, you're going to make some
Just to, as a sponsor of one of the sponsors, we're happy to help host the break that you're going to have. But I want to say thanks to Jay and the SIPA team. I think it's been a really great event, and honored to be a part of it and participate. Thanks.
Thank you for being with us here today. My name is Tarang, and I'm a second-year student at SIPA and a research assistant for Professor Healy. Over the summer, I helped him work on this project on how to make cyberspace more defensible. So I'm very excited to be here today with all of you. Our next and the last panel for the conference is on regulating cybersecurity for the energy transition, which will be moderated by Harry Cressa. So over to Harry.
Thank you so much, and thank you to Columbia University, to SIPA, and everyone here today, and of course to our fantastic panelists. I think this is going to be a wonderful conversation. As I mentioned, I'm Harry Cressa. I am the Director of Studies at the Carnegie Mellon Institute for Strategy and Technology, and until earlier this fall, I was the Assistant National Cyber Director for Strategy at the White House, and before that at the Pentagon, working on the Trump administration's defense cyber strategy. And so I have seen firsthand a lot of the conversation over the last couple of days about more continuity than discontinuity in cyber policy over the last couple of administrations, really last several administrations. It is a field that has benefited dramatically from a arc of iteration rather than a yo-yo of dramatic reversal. And I think the role of civil society and industry in cyber policy in particular has played a critical role of ballast, if you will, in that arc of iteration. And that's why I'm excited for the great panel we have today representing that spectrum of government, civil society, and industry to have this great conversation. So I'd love to do a quick round of introductions to the rest of our panel here, and then we'll kick it off. Sean, do you want to start?
Sure. All right, this is working. I'm Sean Ewart. I'm the Assistant Secretary for Energy in Governor Hochul's office. So in that role, we sort of focus on the day-to-day operations of our energy agencies and authorities in New York. So that includes the Long Island Power Authority, the New York Power Authority, the Department of Public Service, and the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. So I've been in this role for a little over 3 years, and then prior to that, I spent some time in the state legislature working on energy issues, including security. So it's nice to be here.
I'm Michelle Guido, Southern Company, the Strategic Security Policy Director. I am responsible in this role for national security, cyber, physical, natural disasters, anything to do with resilience and reliability within Southern Company, and then probably more from a portfolio for industry in the energy sector. Work very closely with finance and communications. Know many up here. I worked with Harry on the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. My former CEO, Tom Fanning, was a private citizen on the commission. So you probably have seen many of the recommendations that have rolled out and have been implemented into law. And it's just a great pleasure to be here, and I look forward to the conversation. I'm looking forward to the questions that you may have for us.
Hi, I'm Jason Bordoff. I'm a professor of practice here at SIPA. I direct the Center on Global Energy Policy, and been doing that I started the center 12 years ago, and before that served in government, most recently with the energy and climate portfolio in the Obama White House at the National Security Council. So a lot of the work of the center and my own background is at the intersection of national security, geopolitics, foreign policy, and energy and the energy transition. But I'm probably the least knowledgeable person here about cybersecurity in particular, so mostly I'm just excited to learn about that, and maybe from Sean about congestion pricing, but I can bother him about that later.
That's right, John. Are EVs going to get extra dispensation on the congestion pricing?
Stay tuned.
Great. So as we were talking earlier about how the arc of cyber policy is long, but has more continuity than discontinuity to it, right? And I think that there's a number of reasons why it's been so collaborative And one is that even though the nature of the threat changes and the tactics, techniques, and procedures of threat actors evolve over time, the intent and motivations behind them are enduring. And so we change, we evolve. The questions about regulation and policy keep getting updated and renewed, but the fact that this is a space in which bad guys want to do bad things does not fundamentally change. And I think that the energy ecosystem is a great illustration of this, of what endures even when there is tremendous the energy system is a part of our critical infrastructure that just has to work. You heard in the prior panel on healthcare cybersecurity about how a couple things not working starts resulting in people dying very quickly. And electricity and our broader energy ecosystem is one of those as well. Like society will start showing its cracks if it is not working. And that makes it an attractive target for threat actors who want to cause problems, who want to create those cracks. We've seen it in non-state actors with ransomware attacks. We remember Colonial Pipeline, which was certainly a watershed event in policy and the energy ecosystem. But we also have seen more recent news and disclosures about state-backed actors, notably Volt Typhoon and others working on behalf of the People's Republic of China to pre-position disruptive and destructive capabilities on the US energy ecosystem to hold our critical infrastructure at risk in a time of crisis. And you've seen senior leaders in government put out reports, testify before Congress, and partner with Microsoft on some of their recent threat intelligence disclosures about how these are efforts by governments to be able to not only disrupt the United States' ability to mobilize in the event of a conflict, but also to provoke chaos and panic, and thus harm our ability and will to endure. So that is all, while the techniques and specific examples of that are relatively new, the intent behind it is not. That's the kind of thing we've known that the PRC and other competitors have been interested in doing for some time. But of course now layer on a new variable of dynamism, and that is the energy transition. The couple of the only existential threats to Americans' way of life are great power conflict and climate change. And they are increasingly intermingling. And the energy transition is providing both new sources of hope and innovation against those challenges and novel cybersecurity considerations. The clean energy transition is providing a huge impetus for modernization across our critical infrastructure that was never designed to be as digitized as it is now, and clean energy is providing a vehicle for much more technically sophisticated and theoretically inherently more defensible technologies that are more digitally strengthen our defenses against threat actors. It also, that energy transition is also bringing a proliferation of connectivity. That inherently more digitally interconnected ecosystem is going to dramatically expand the number and variety of internet-connected devices on our critical infrastructure. So it's going to cut both ways, like great promise and potential for significant complication. And it's all happening in the ecosystem of in the context of the first significant electricity load growth in quite some time. And these are all exciting, interesting, new challenges that we're facing here, and we've got like the perfect panel to discuss it. And so first I wanted to hand it over to Jason to discuss the state of play with that transition, the big dynamics underway, and how we should think about that in the context of the coming government transition.
Oh, you gave such a good overview. You've kind of answered any question I think we could address for the next 30 minutes or so. But and your introduction about resilience, obviously cyber, one piece of that. There are others, natural disasters, and those are getting worse in part because of climate change. Was reminding me of, I had accepted the offer to join the Columbia faculty. Academic year starts in September 2012. That was when President Obama was just about to finish his first term, and at the last minute they had said, "Can you stay till Inauguration Day?" So so I had about a few months of commuting until January of 2013. And for those who may remember, something happened in the middle, which was, right, so I was in New York, kind of half working remotely and half getting to DC 3 or 4 days a week when Superstorm Sandy hit. And one of the things I remember managing that crisis was like at some point just getting in my car and driving around New York to figure out what was happening at gasoline stations because we had such poor information to understand the availability of fuel supplies. If electricity was the problem, if the Port of New York access was the problem, and everything else. So there's so many things we have to do to harden our infrastructure. And I was just thinking about that as you were giving your intro. I mean, I'll start with like a 30,000 super high-level view of where we are in the energy transition because I think it's important to remember the scale and magnitude of the undertaking we are trying to pursue here. And as a result of that, two things can be true at the same time. So the pace of growth in clean energy globally, I'm thinking with a global perspective, is staggering, remarkable. This year, about twice as much will be spent globally on clean energy as on fossil fuels, 2 trillion to 1 trillion. In 2020, 1 in 20 cars sold globally was electric. This year it'll be around 1 in 5. 2/3 of the new electricity generation capacity added around the world last year was renewable. And if you look over the last 10, 15 years, the cost of solar down more than 90%, wind down 70 to 80%, batteries down 90%. Like on every dimension you could imagine, if you had gone back 10 years and asked someone, where would we be on cost? Where would we be on annual growth rates? We're sort of exceeding many people's wildest expectations. And this year, oil use will go up, and gas use will go up, and coal use will go up, and global emissions will go up. And so it is just a function of the scale and magnitude, again, of the global energy system and how big it is, that those two, we're in the middle now of, people use the phrase clean energy transition, but that means moving away from something. Like, to be clear, in history, we have never moved away from anything. If someone says to you energy transition, you'll think in your head maybe of a chart from 1850 to today, from 0 to 100%. And as a percentage matter, we've seen these great shifts over time from wood to coal, and then coal to oil, and then gas, and increasingly, although still small, zero carbon energy. In total energy use, every one of those things is higher today, even wood, than it was in 1850, because population grows and global GDP grows. And so we're doing both of those things at the same time. In a new world of great power, competition, and rivalry, a major motivating force for, I mentioned a moment ago how, like, we've gone to up to 2 trillion spent on clean energy. 40% of that is spending in China. And a major reason why the cost of clean energy has come down as much as it has is China. But the dominant role that China has in clean energy supply chains, more than 90% of solar panels, 70 to 90% of refining and processing of critical minerals, batteries, increasingly electric vehicles, which are not just cheap, but actually very good vehicles, are viewed in many ways. You want clean energy to be as cheap as possible so you can deploy it as fast as possible, but a concentration in any supply chain in one country, particularly one where you might perceive it to be a geostrategic adversary, is perceived as a risk, and cyber is a component of that. As the clean energy deployment we know that a world that transitions to a low-carbon economy is going to be an electrified economy in very significant measure. Maybe not everything, but much more electrified than it is today. And there are benefits to some extent, as Europe learned recently with imported pipeline gas from Russia, or as we remember from the Arab oil embargo, to moving from globally traded hydrocarbons, inevitably exposed to geopolitical risk, to electricity. Electricity is much more local, not entirely, but more locally produced. Global trade in energy-related goods and services, according to the IEA, goes down around 60% in a net zero scenario. So there are security benefits from that, but there's also risks. And the electricity grid, we don't have a strategic electricity stockpile. The grid has to be perfectly balanced every second of the year. And the grid today, I don't know, I'm curious to hear my co-panelists, they know more about it than I do, has kind of a small margin for error in many parts of the country. Not as much of a buffer as you might want in a world that is facing worse risks in terms of cyber, in terms of severe weather events, and, as Harry said, in a world where we've lost muscle memory. We have how to deal with rising electricity demand, and suddenly electricity demand is projected to soar. We have an administration coming in that has promised to cut energy prices in half. I think not a partisan comment. That's not easy to do. But if you're worried about energy prices, and this election was a reminder people care about costs, I'd be more worried about electricity prices in the next couple of years than I would be about where oil prices are going. And there are a lot of things we do to build infrastructure again in this country, to modernize the grid, and to do utility reform. We can talk about what that means in various ways to just help to increase the reliability and modernize the grid. And cyber is a really important piece of that, particularly as we electrify more and more things. And the growth in clean energy, the scale of what we have to do is so big that it's very hard to do it without taking the demand side into consideration as well, and trying to use energy services, use energy more efficiently. And all of those demand side measures, create a lot of opportunity where devices are interconnected, but there's also cyber vulnerability there, obviously.
Sean, Jason's fantastic overview there of the tremendous diversity and complexity of dynamics at play connected wonderfully the epochal, global level kinds of dynamics to the very tangible local considerations of distribution of the grid, right? Like, there's basically 3 buckets when you're thinking about our energy ecosystem: your generation, where it's actually made; the transmission, like large quantities at high voltages moving places; but then the critical component of distribution, right? Where most of the mass of our energy ecosystem resides, where that electricity gets to people, to customers, to where it needs to go, and that is overwhelmingly state regulated. How are you, from your vantage point in the New York State, energy ecosystem, thinking about the challenges and opportunities of this transition and of the technological and cyber implications that are playing into that?
Yeah, thanks. And I think it was a great overview. You're absolutely right that as we're having this transition, we're seeing just so much of our critical infrastructure becoming both connected digitally, but then also on the electric sector itself. So I think back to the 2003 blackout, where you have the electric grid goes out, but everybody can still drive their car because it's gas powered. Today, we need to make sure that our sort of fundamental infrastructure, which is going to be more electric in the future, is secure. And I think that from the state perspective, we talk about these global threats, but at the distribution utility level, and from a regulatory perspective, we're really thinking about this through rate cases. And we're thinking about how do we take these priorities and turn them into something actionable at the level that impacts customers. From that perspective, and I think everybody here is going to be interacting with the grid for the most part at that distribution level. And to your point, all of that, nationally is regulated at the state level. So some states have been taking action, and I'm very proud of the action that we've been taking in New York. We have some great partners in the state legislature who helped us work on legislation that the governor signed 2 years ago that really sort of begins to get at this issue from the state perspective. And I would say one of the first things that, that we were able to do was put into our state energy law this prioritization of the security of critical energy infrastructure and some definitions. So this is now in our state law. It's a requirement that we focus on it. The other thing, and this I think came up on the healthcare panel too, was thinking about this from sort of an emergency response perspective. Last year, we set into place another part of this legislation. We've enacted it now, where all of our utilities on an annual basis have to submit emergency response plans that take into account cybersecurity risks, but with a specific focus not just on customer data, but on the potential for blackouts to occur as a result of cyber attack. So that's a new thing. This is in our state regulation. It's in our state law. And we're continuing to work through this process of doing the implementation of the law that will include things like, for example, real-time monitoring of the grid for cyber attack. And that will include a heavy focus on this sort of what is the kinetic impact of a cyber attack, and what are the risks to people, at the very basic level of, can you turn on the light? And that's really where our focus is. I think that, broadly speaking, we have, we're obviously very plugged in with NARUC and Department of Energy as they're working through the distribution utility guidelines and these principles for cybersecurity. I think one of the challenges is sort of connecting this broad perspective on international sort of prioritization, and of course we see this in our clean energy transition. How do we sort of set ourselves up, relative to other actors across the globe? But at the public utility level, we also just need to think about this in the context of resiliency, reliability, and just sort of the fundamentals of rate making, which is maybe a little boring, but this is the reality. This is sort of where I think, in New York, 22 million people are impacted at a very fundamental level by the decisions that are made. And that's going to be the case nationally too. So I think that we're, as this transition continues, it's going to be just a fundamental part of this. Will need to be connecting the dots between what are the federal priorities and how do we sort of get them, implemented through that rate case basis.
Fantastic. Michelle, as we connect those dots, how are industry and asset owners and operators integrating with that ecosystem, making sense and comprehending it, providing their feedback to refine it better? And how do you see that evolving alongside the energy transition and the new kinds of stakeholders coming into it?
Well, it's all around partnership, and there's so many partnerships, but when you look out at critical infrastructure, and 83% is owned and operated by the private sector, I've seen a transition in the last 20 years working with energy. When we used to have disasters, it was all natural disasters. You draw a circle around a region and the power was out. And it was storm response, and we have great mutual assistance. I'm sure you see when you have a hurricane, the trucks going down to Florida. They come from all over the country in Canada. Great, great teamwork, partnership, and collaboration, and it's from poles and wires. So we're talking about energy transition. We were talking about cyber. We're talking about physical. Even last week, drones over power plants in Tennessee during the election. So there's all these variables, and we have to, look at our capabilities. We have to understand that, clean energy is here. We want safe, affordable, reliable, resilient strategies, but it has to come through partnership. So it's asset owners and operators, but it's working with our states. It's working with the governors. It's working with the regulators. It's going back into the federal government and working with our Sector Risk Management Agency, DOE. And there's a lot of priorities there, but who owns and operates It's the asset owners and operators who have to implement, who have to keep the lights on, who are also dealing with the customers and want to make sure that things are affordable. And so there's a lot of factors here. And we're looking at strategy from various perspectives. So I work in DC. I'm not a lobbyist. I work with lobbyists. But what we're trying to do for the last 13 years is, when you said Superstorm Sandy, that was a transition point for our energy subsector of electricity. Superstorm Sandy is when our Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council became CEOs. And my CEO, Tom Fanning, became the co-chair, representing investor-owned utilities. And we also have municipals and cooperatives co-chairs. But that is the strategic arm of working with the federal government on resiliency and what we need to do. Many of what we're doing from a federal perspective needs to be incorporated down into the state level, especially when we get to this digital ecosystem where there are no islands and where there is interdependencies and dependencies. We're dependent, one of our Achilles heels is the communication sector. So how is communications as a sector working with their regulators and working through the FCC and CISA as their sector risk management agency? How are we going to incorporate what they're doing on that bad day and their plans with our plans? And so we're very good vertically from a federal perspective, but I think we can challenge ourselves and be better horizontally. We have to be interwoven across sectors, from the federal, state, local. When we get into cyber, international, space is becoming something that's an interdependency of everything that we have, and GPS, running the grid. And then we go back into the clean energy, which we're moving towards, supply chain. How are we challenging ourselves with supply chain? What are we looking at, and how are we bringing it in? And how are we having the conversations with the manufacturers, with the vendors? So there's a lot of dynamics, and there's a lot of partnerships and collaborations that have to be had, and I think we should challenge ourselves to remove from the silos and really have these priorities discussions.
Yeah, I mean, if I can just piggyback on that, I think you make a really great point that there are no islands anymore. And I think that traditionally the way that we've considered regulation is looking at these, these sort of centers that are very attractive to particular, threat actors. And so that's why you look at, a generator, a large generating facility. You look at bulk transmission infrastructure. But as we move forward, we're going to have a much more interconnected grid. We currently have a Grid of the Future proceeding at our Public Service Commission, where we're looking at the options for virtual power plants and how do we sort of implement this broader, more broadly. As a result, we're going to see at the distribution level, and again, this is certainly a national and an international phenomenon. We're going to see more sort of generation aggregated at this distribution level, with the potential for for threat actors to to be able to take advantage of whatever risks we sort of leave open there. So I think that's, to your point about there are no islands anymore. It's absolutely the case that we sort of have to take a top to bottom look at how this is going to work, and its function is going to be as critical to the clean energy transition as building more transmission infrastructure and and building out additional supply chains on clean energy infrastructure.
That's great, and it also reflects, I think, this conversation is bringing together by necessity a lot of stakeholders in the system that have not traditionally had occasion to do so. Much of my last year in the Biden administration is centered around corralling some of these uncommon collaborations. I came from the more kind of military-oriented, offensive cyber side of things, but ended up spending much of my last year with the clean energy leadership in government because of these interesting questions and novel considerations for the much more technically sophisticated and digitally interconnected world of clean energy. And I found, as I co-chaired an effort to put together the kind of clean energy security priorities for this transition with our climate and clean energy friends. And we found that getting the glowering national security threat-focused people like me and my friends and the affirmative vision, optimistic climate and energy folks on the other side of the table, just to speak the same language was a challenge. To be able to say, oh, I didn't know that was possible if we actually did combine information and operational technology. Or in the other direction, it's like, wait, you're wanting to connect what to the internet now? Right. It's like all kinds of conversations there. And so, Jason, I would love to ask, like, what kinds of culture clashes you've seen in conversations about the global energy transition, particularly when it comes to supply chains in China. You had mentioned so much going on there. Do you feel like the folks who are worried about it don't understand the centrality of or the difficulty of doing anything about it, or the folks who are invested in those Chinese supply chains are aware of what kinds of considerations they need to take into account?
Yeah, I think it's why, as you said, dialogue is so important. Why work like we do at SIPA, or even within the Center on Global Energy Policy, which intentionally has expertise in sanctions and tariffs and trade and Saudi and Russia, with people whose expertise is energy, the energy transition, and climate change, because these issues are so cross-cutting. And I think often I don't know, Sean, if you like in discussions with the environmental community, I don't like to paint with a broad brush, and even the oil and gas industry, but China's often pointed to as a leader in the energy transition. And I understand, looking at some pieces of data, why people see that. There's tremendous growth in clean energy and renewables. The Chinese government generally recognizes that climate change is a reality. It is an incredibly large economy and a lot of people, and economic growth often trumps other concerns. So there's also a lot of coal still being used, still being built. Security, in part, they argue for reasons of resilience. We're not running these at capacity, but it's just there in case we need them. And we can be skeptical about whether, we'll see if that turns out to be true or not. But as I said a moment ago, my friend Jason Furman at Harvard, who's former economist, still an economist, formerly an economist for President Obama, I heard him at some point a couple of years ago, I think on my podcast, say, the words we use when we talk about climate change, which are justified by all the climate scientists here at Columbia and lots of words like existential, the threat we are talking, we don't really act like we believe those words to be true. So we have multiple policy objectives, of course, at any given time, and you need to balance a variety of things: economic growth, national security, politics. But if you really believe that to be true, as Jason said, you might care less about where your clean energy comes from than how cheap it is, because we have to deploy it much, much faster. But that's not our only concern. We have other values and other principles, like not using forced labor. Or playing by rules of free and fair trade. I see Merit Jaina here. She knows more about that than any of us. And when you look at the actions, for example, taken by the Biden administration with tariffs applied toward Chinese manufactured clean energy products, solar panels, EVs, in many ways a continuation. There's one area of consistency across these two administrations. There are multiple rationales. It's national security, because EVs collect data and raise privacy and cyber concerns. We want to build domestically competitive industries. We can't maintain political support for the Inflation Reduction Act if everybody loses their jobs in Michigan in the process of implementing this. Chinese manufacturing is more carbon intensive. John Podesta gave a big speech at our conference in April about that. So there's all of these competing policy objectives we have. And I do think there's a real tension. I guess I'll put it this way. I think if you're going to address the new world of great power competition, security, economic, carbon concerns about the dominant position China has in clean energy supply chains, and try to meaningfully reduce that role and diversify those supply chains through trade policy, through domestic subsidies, This is a large, not a small headwind to the pace of the clean energy transition. And I just don't think we're having an honest enough conversation. It's kind of like we have IRA subsidies and we have tariffs, and let's do some permitting reform, and we'll make it easier to build clean energy and do mining and refining and processing all over the United States. It's just the scale is too big for that to be a serious response. It's part of the response. But I do think we have to confront more the real tension that exists between these multiple policy objectives.
Extremely well said. And we need help in figuring out how to confront those tensions. And so now we're going to turn to the audience.
Yeah.
So is any questions here for our illustrious panel here today? Professor Healy, yes.
Great, thank you. As I think about, as we're looking at the energy transition, or even if it's not transition, just as we're bringing new things online, right? I tend to be really focused on which of them are most dependent on software, because the ones that are most dependent on software open up that attack surface. And so I'm just curious, I don't know who takes this, but for example, we heard the governor yesterday talking about, the bring your own modular reactor as we're opening up, right? Are those software dependent, right? As we're thinking about, obviously as we're thinking about adding new things in to the grid that's doing generation, I imagine that's a very software intense process on timing and the other bits, but I'm not sure. So I'm curious, as someone that doesn't know the sector so well, like where are those areas that are most software intensive and that we need to start be thinking about our and maybe EV charging infrastructure, Hari, because I know you'd worked on that. Thanks.
Sure.
I can maybe jump in quickly. I think it's a great point, and I don't know if anybody here has ever had the pleasure of going into a very old power plant. It's a little bit like going into like Battlestar Galactica, and there's a reason why they did so well. So I think that we begin to see that as we are moving into this future where we need a much more responsive grid, it kind of requires that introduction of new software into the ecosystem. But it has these inherent risks that have to be addressed. And so I think, to your point, there's this constant sort of give and take in this transition between the need to be responsive, the need to sort of have this flexibility, combined with the need to sort of move forward into this new future. And I think that that's really the role, at least how I see, the role of the regulator as being the correct place to sort of mediate that dispute. And so I'm hopeful that we'll get that right. Hopefully the first time too, we'll see.
I'll add, especially since this allows me the opportunity to shamelessly plug the coming report from the Carnegie Mellon Institute for Strategy and Technology on PRC technology, cyber risk, and clean energy. I think there's a way that you can consider a threat spectrum here in how you are going to prioritize your considerations. Solar panels are commodity sorts of technologies that are, they have semiconductors in them, but they are, generally speaking, very dumb, very cheap, and very systemically important to the clean energy transition. And they get aggregated up into inverters, right? And if you decided you wanted to try and do something nefarious, they would be very difficult with a relatively dumb solar panel. It would probably break down by the time you started working your way up the value chain. And so you can make a strong argument that solar panels are probably at the low end of what you should be worried about. On the other end of that spectrum might be like virtual power plant software, things that are entirely software defined and that directly control the dispatching and flow of electricity. And the good news is that re-architecting a software supply chain is easier than a critical mineral supply chain. And so I think you can create a spectrum there of what we'd want to be concerned about, both from a cyber risk perspective and how we would navigate the headwinds that Jason was talking about along the way there. Of course, the tricky part is where in the middle is the tipping point, but I think that we have the tools to be a little more empirical about it than just, everything's made in China, or it has to be not made in China. There's some nuance there that can help us have our cake and eat it too.
Can I just ask, I don't know if I'm allowed to, one of the examples you gave in your opening was Colonial, is not about a clean energy transition. Like the oil and gas industry is digitally connected, increasingly using tools of AI and other technologies, Iran taking down the Saudi Aramco computer system, or Colonial. Like, how unique are these two, clean energy versus oil and gas?
Precisely, yeah. I think that that's exactly the question. And we have a situation right now where our energy ecosystem, while the transition is growing like gangbusters, is still mostly fossil-based and still mostly made up of technologies that are decades old and were never designed to be connected to the internet or digitized. But as per a couple rather alarming GAO reports in 23 and 21, are nonetheless being digitized, regardless of whether it is via clean energy or not. And in fact, I know that there's a lot of remote access and monitoring technologies.
If you go into the control room at Schlumberger, it's amazing. They're
Indeed.
like a guy sitting at one desk controlling rigs and drilling activity all around the world.
Precisely, exactly. So like these questions are not unique to clean energy at all. But what I think the opportunity is with the clean energy transition is that these technologies are much more inherently digitally native and software defined and can be built from the ground up with security by design in mind, rather than, we have lots of great examples like that one of like very well put together, IT/OT combination of fossil tech, but for every one of those, there's 20 others where someone slapped a dial-up modem to the side of a dam, right?
I would just add, besides security, we're having the risk conversations and all of that.
Absolutely.
So I don't know, years ago if we were having the risk conversation. We may have been, partially the security, but we're really trying to go deep with the risk. And I think that's part of the equation.
Hear, hear.
Can I just do a quick follow-up?
Please.
Where does next generation nuclear fit into that, and when can we expect your report?
You can expect my report in the next few weeks, depending on White House pre-publication security clearance. Thanks for everyone out there watching. I think I'd probably kick it over to the rest of the panel on the question about advanced nuclear and the considerations there.
I mean, I guess I can jump in and just say that I don't think we know, but I think that as it sort of is a developing technology, it will have to fit into a sort of well-reasoned regulatory regime to ensure that it is implemented safely. So I think that's probably where it's at.
Software, like, is it super software dependent, or is it more digitally?
To be an armchair energy analyst here, I think that it's probably less of a software-intensive kind of proposition than a distributed energy situation would be. But if one of the advantages of your kind of small modular nuclear reactor is that it's more flexible, it can be turned up or down with more less control rod drama, then you could see novel software considerations there.
Thank you.
Yeah, Munis.
Hi, I want to pull on two threads that came up. One is one that Professor Healy brought up around software. If you could talk about open source software, where you see that fitting in here, that doesn't fit under any regulatory regime, and there's a lot of open source providers, if you can call them that don't qualify as suppliers by any stretch of the imagination, but they're in energy management systems, they're in battery management systems, ubiquitous in battery management systems. So one question there. Second is about this risk regulation, the risk-based approach. I'm curious what lessons, if they are there, and Michelle, this question is primarily for you, but interested for both of you as well, around the battery issue around cattle, transformer, industrial policy, and where that came into regulation, even in distributed energy resources, and the supply chain risk conversation. We need to have resiliency and redundancy, but all the providers are essentially from the PRC. So how do you live with that? And instead of asking, how do we live without it? Thanks.
Michelle, do you want to take that second question first?
Sure. Ongoing. Thank you for the question. Great question, because it's continuous, right? The CATL, the batteries. Another partner that we work with in that would be the Department of Defense. and the conversations. So how do you influence the policy? How do you really understand the inventory? It's from the supply chain perspective, I've just seen an increase of these policy discussions in the last 2 years. From transformers to there's a union strike in getting in goods, and from other countries, then also where they're coming in from. So you have someone like me who's trying to look at the risk and look at the strategy, working with our lobbyists, working internally with those that are on the EMS system who know the OT. It's just, I think we've got to get better at what I said before, having these conversations and putting the risk, because how I'm looking at the risk may not be how internally those who are running the EMS systems are looking at the risk. And then where are we using, the batteries? So we go out to your supply chain, and then they're learning geopolitical. They're learning, something that finance has always probably known in their digital world. We're having geopolitical conversations internally within our supply chains. Then we're going out and we're talking to our state regulators. And they know their energy, they know the needs, they know the customers, but do they understand the risk? And what's their influence? So I don't have a direct answer. I can say that it's on the table and I've seen it increase in the last 2 years. I don't think it's going away. I think we can challenge ourselves to be better and more informed and to have different skill sets and subject matter expertise around the table when we're talking about especially the supply chain.
And we're at time, so I will close us out with a quick note on the open source software question. I think that it mirrors a lot of the dynamics in the broader energy transition where we're benefiting from the kind of democratized dynamism of technical experts who are not embedded in huge traditional stakeholders who are bringing new ideas to the space, but also if mobilized in the right way and told to look out for the right things, can be, a tremendous number more eyes and ears on what right looks like. Open source software, especially in more software-defined energy resources, is going to be foundational to the clean energy transition. A lot of VPPs, a lot of battery management software, a lot of OCS generally is based on open source, and we need as many eyes looking at that code as possible, and that's how we'll be able to build this more inherently defensible and more inherently secure and resilient system with the help of that transition. So thank you all for being here today. Thank you so much to my co-panelists, and thank you to Columbia and SIPA.
And hey, everyone, I'm Jason Healy. To close us out, if you haven't met me yet, I'm the director of the SIPA Cyber Program. Thank you to everyone here in the audience today and yesterday. Thanks to all of our partners and sponsors, including Columbia's Institute for Global Politics, the Columbia Engineering, Columbia Data Science Institute, as well as our sponsors, Venable, Kyndryl, Kroll, JP Morgan Chase, especially Google Cloud and Microsoft, with whom this could not have been possible. My thanks to my deputy Irva, to Daniel, whom you've seen with the hat here as the captain, making sure things are running, Mike back in the booth, Brett, who's been helping on the website, the live stream, social, Susan Lee on events, Lionel on communications, all of the amazing student volunteers who have been helping out, many of whom have been our research associates, but a lot of others are just helping out so that they can be part of an amazing event. So we've been live streaming. Those are going to be edited up by panel, starting with those from the IGP events from yesterday with the governor and the secretary and the dean and the deputy national security advisor. So those should be up very shortly. I think we already have the live streams up or shortly for each day, and then we'll be slicing those up and editing them by panel. And with that, thank you to all of you again, and we put a close to the first annual Columbia University Conference on Cyber Regulation and Harmonization. Thank you very much. Rousing applause. Thank you very much.